All right, good morning, everyone. A little loud there. Uh, Happy almost New Year. So I'm not quite there yet. Let's go ahead and pray, and then we'll get into Daniel. Father in heaven, thank you for this time we have to come together and study, Father. Be with those that aren't able to be here due to sickness or traveling. Just pray that they might be able to be with us at the next appointed time. We especially ask that you continue to be with our brother Matt as he's still recovering from his surgery, and thank you for the presence of Dina being able to be back with us. And Father, as we enter into this time of study, just help us to have clear minds and hearts so that we might absorb into our hearts the things we have to learn through your word. And we are thankful for your word, and we're especially thankful for our Lord and Savior Jesus, who is your word in the flesh. It's in his name we pray. Amen. All right, Daniel is where we're going to be. I can find it. All right, there we go. Daniel chapter 12. We've been looking at the character of Daniel, and we're actually going to conclude that study before we transition into something else. So Daniel chapter 12, it is the concluding chapter of this book, and so it's only fitting that we conclude our study in this chapter. So in this chapter, the author of Daniel, who we are assuming is Daniel himself, is recording for us one of the final visions we read about in this book. More specifically, based on verses 1 through 4 of this chapter deals with a vision concerning what was going to be happening with God's people as the end of time was approaching. Now, it's in that context that as we reach verse 5 of this chapter, the text says, "Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others were standing, one on this bank of the river and the other on that bank of the river." So, what is Daniel seeing here in verse 5? Okay, so yeah, it's two different individuals. It is pretty simple. He's seeing two people on either side of the river where he's at, possibly and probably angels. Now, the river that he's at here, just on a side note, this is the Tigris River. And something else we should understand, I've already said this, but again, what we should also understand here is that the individuals down here, that Daniel sees here, are probably angels. Now, it's been said, we don't know this for certain by any stretch of the imagination, but it has been said by some commentators that one of these angels might be Jesus appearing in angelic form in his pre-incarnate form. But we don't know that. I'm just telling you that because it's been said. Anything else on verse 5? Okay. So verse 5 is one of those stage-setting verses that set the stage for what we read in the concluding verses of the book of Daniel, which are verses 6 through 13, where among the things that Daniel learns through this vision is that he would enter rest. And that rest is as a result of his faithfulness to God that we have seen all throughout our study of Daniel's character in this book. Now, so it's this point about Daniel entering rest that we're going to deal with today as we examine 2 points about Daniel entering rest from the text of verses 6 through 13, when that will conclude our study of the character of Daniel. The first point we'll examine from verses 6 through 8 is that Daniel would enter rest even though he did not understand everything. Second point we'll examine from verses 9 through 13 is that Daniel would enter rest even though the words he received would be sealed up. Now, after looking at these things, what we will learn is that we too have a rest to look forward to, and we'll talk about that when we get there. But let's read verses 6 through 13, and then we'll look at the points. Again, this is Daniel chapter 12, beginning in verse 6. The text says, "And one said to the man dressed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, 'How long will it be until the end of these wonders?' I heard the man dressed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, as he raised his right hand and his left toward heaven, and swore by him who lives forever that it would be for a time, times, and half a time. And as soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be completed. As for me, I heard but could not understand. So I said, My Lord, what will be the outcome of these events? He said, Go your way, Daniel, for these words are concealed and sealed up until the end time. Many will be purged, purified, and refined, but the wicked will act wickedly, and none of the wicked will understand, but those who have insight will understand. From the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. How blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains to the 1,335 days. But as for you, go your way to the end, then you will enter into rest and rise again for your allotted portion at the end of the age. So there's a lot of information here, but we're looking at it in this context of Daniel entering rest. First point, Daniel would enter rest even though he did not understand everything. Now that point is introduced in verse 6 with the beginning of a conversation between the two individuals where one asked, as the text says, how long will it be until the end of these wonders? So it's a question. What's the question he's asking? If we're going to paraphrase it. How much time till this happens? How much time will this go on until it's all completed? So with that in mind, one thing we should understand from this verse is that the word wonders here, let me first ask, does everyone have the word wonders? Yes? Okay. So we don't need to deal with different wording, but that word is another way of referring to the things Daniel has seen, not only in the immediate context of chapter 12, but also in the broader context of the book. Daniel has seen a lot of different things in our study that we've been looking at. And so now this question is asked, how long till the end of these things? Questions or comments on verse 6? Okay. Yes, that's...
Aside from Daniel, there's a third individual that is dressed in white linen.
One of them is dressed in, yeah, I failed to touch on that. One of them is dressed in linen. There's two, but there's not three angels. There's two, and they're kind of talking to each other, but one of those two, the text says, is dressed in linen.
Well, as the picture I got,
There's a third?
I've got two.
Okay. You,
One
actually, oh, I see what you're talking about.
is over the water.
Okay, I see what you're talking about. I hadn't noticed that. And I, Daniel, looked and behold two. And one said to the man dressed in linen who was above the wall. I see that. I am so sorry. I did not pick up on that when I was preparing this text. Thank you for pointing that out, Dad. So yes, there is probably a third individual present above the waters of the river. I totally missed that, and that is my fault. You have a footnote there that says upstream? I don't have that footnote. Okay. Who was above the waters of the river. So yes, that's a good, I failed to make that observation. So there's two on the banks and then one above the waters. And it's that one who is dressed in linen. And I think that's where the idea comes from, that this might be Jesus in angelic form, that third individual, not one of the two on the banks. I am so sorry for not picking that up. Andrea, go ahead. In the Hebrew? I didn't get that deep into the... I am not well versed on Hebrew, so I didn't really take a look at each of those individual words. So, but Elaine's footnote might have something to do with that. It might literally mean upstream. Good observation. And I apologize for not catching that myself. Okay, so we're still in verse 6. And then, no, we're in verse 7. Yes. Sorry, I lost my train of thought in that conversation. So, this question is asked. Sorry, go ahead, Andrea. And the word these is inserted because if you have it in italics, these is not in the original text. But it's still, that's the idea of the question, is how long is this going to last? Right. Yeah, this still goes back not only in the verses 1 through 4, but it goes back into chapter 11 as well. So this question is asked, how does what's apparently a third individual respond? What's the response to the question, in other words? Yeah, we're back in verse 7. He gives those words, but what else does he do? What's the gesture he makes? He raises both of his hands. And that's the way, and it says, swore by him who lives forever. So he's making an oath. But yes, the time aspect is this time times and half a time. Now that phrase, we've seen it before, and it's a phrase that literally speaking refers to 3.5 years. But it's figuratively used here to refer to a short period of time. Now in the grand scheme of time, 3.5 years, it's not that long. So that phrase is used here figuratively to say that it's a short period of time. But the thought doesn't stop there. And it says, as soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will take place. Who are the holy people? Who are we assuming are the holy people? The Israelites, God's people, the set apart people. What's going to happen to them? At least for the... Sorry, somebody started to say something. I thought. Destruction. They're going to go through these trials. They're going to be defeated. That's part of what's already going on at the time Daniel writes. But all these things are going to last as long as God's people are going through those trials. But part of the point being made here is that those trials they're going through are going to come to an end. It's going to be a relatively short period of time. And we say relatively because this time is it's God's perspective on time. Now, you've seen me draw this before, but here's eternity. Our time today, right there, just one spot on that line. So that's why this time, times, and half a time idea comes up, because it's going to be a relatively short period of time in terms of eternity. Questions or comments on that? Okay. So I know that's a lot of information. But moving on to verse 8, what does Daniel ask next? What's his next question? The outcome. And what's an outcome? The end result. So he's got in his mind, all these things are going to happen, but my Lord, what's going to be the result of all these things? Now, notice the word Lord there, it's not capitalized. That word Lord, it's not always a reference to God. It's a term of respect. The equivalent of sir in the English language. So Daniel is respectfully asking this individual, what's going to be the end result of these events? Now, why does he ask that question? He's not understanding. Right. Exactly. He doesn't understand all this. He wants to know more about this. We're going to look at the response to this question in just a minute. But putting verses 6 through 8 together in that context of Daniel entering rest is that Daniel would enter rest even though he did not understand everything. In verses 6 through 8, Daniel has shown that he did not understand everything, but context shows that he would still enter into rest. Now, what this should help us to understand then is that we don't have to understand everything to go into our rest. We don't have to go to our grave thinking we need to understand everything just so we can go to heaven. That's not required of us. Now, we need to seek to understand, but God does not require us to understand everything just so we can make it, so to speak. But that brings us to verses 9 through 13. The second point is Daniel would enter rest even though the words he received would be sealed up. So now we're at the response to Daniel's question in verse 9. How does this individual respond to Daniel's question? And what does that mean? Go on your way. That's it. He's basically telling him, don't worry about it. Don't worry about the outcome. As Blake put, you just keep living your life in faithfulness to God. Why? What's going to happen to these words? And what does that mean, that they're sealed up? Okay, they're not going to change. Okay, they'll be revealed at the end, but he says concealed and sealed up. When something is concealed, what does that mean? It's hidden away. But the point being made here is, Daniel, don't worry about it. Now, again, I'm using my words there. Keep living your life. Because these words, they're hidden away. You don't need to know. I was putting a little twist on that. Daniel, you're on a need-to-know basis. You don't need to know. Questions or comments on verse 9? Keep on keeping on. Right. Exactly. So don't worry about those things that God hasn't revealed. Right. Right. Exactly. Anything else on verse 9?
I also think it's interesting that through the course of Daniel, chapter 11 and all the historical prophecies that were already established, that basically it's already been established that God has control over history. So it's not saying hey, don't worry about this. This is going to come to pass. And there's a question that well, is this trustworthy? I mean, there's already been so much revealed that has been shown through chapter 11. You can count on this, but you don't need to know.
Exactly. You can trust that it's all true. Anything else on verse 9? Okay. Now, verse 10 the individual Daniel is speaking to goes on to give a further description of what would happen to God's people as the wicked continue to act wickedly but would not understand, but those who had insight would understand. So again, we see a further description, but I'll just read the verse again. It says, "Many will be purged, purified, and refined, but the wicked will act wickedly, and none of the wicked will understand, but those who have insight will understand." Now, one thing we should understand here is that what is said here is a contrast between God's people who would be purged, purified, and refined. Now, what does that refer to? They're purged, purified, and refined. What have we already learned that's going to happen to them? They're going to be destroyed, but what else? They're going to be tested. And we're not going to get bogged down in those three words, but what those three words have in common is that they're going to be tested. And who's going to put them to testing? I mean, God, but who else is mentioned in this verse? The wicked. It's these wicked people that are going to cause them to suffer. But the wicked won't understand. They're not going to understand why God's people are willing to suffer so much. But the verse ends with those who have insight will understand. What does it mean to have insight into something? Understanding a purpose. Insight and understand, they're parallel words. But who has the insight in this verse? God's people. We are the ones who understand what our suffering is accomplishing in our relationship with God. And so we're willing to go through it. At least we should be willing to go through it because we understand what God is doing. He's purging us. He's purifying us. He's refining us, making us stronger. Questions or comments on verse 10? I know this is a lot of information, but verse 11, we find another timeline. This is where the text also presents some challenges, but it says that the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. So first we see something else that's going to happen, and that's the regular sacrifice being abolished. Now, according to that statement, what's one thing that's going to happen? I know it's not an easy question. But the text says it's going to be abolished. And what is that? How is that going to happen? Okay, that's true. Destruction of the temple. Some of these things that have been already prophesied. One thing that happens to the temple, that we know has happened to the temple over history, it's been destroyed. And then we have this idea of the abomination of desolation being set up. Now, from a historical standpoint, what is said here refers to one of the several occasions where temple worship would end because the temple would be destroyed. But in addition to that, something else that happened was these foreign nations that came invading, is they would use the temple for their own pagan worship. So it's not always the temple being destroyed, it's the temple being used by foreign people to worship their own gods. But we have a timeline here. It would last 1,290 days, which is simply another way of saying that this would last only a short time. Questions or comments on verse 11? Yeah, I didn't note here how long that was in terms of years, but it's just another figurative number to emphasize the fact that it would last a short time.
And my note on that was anywhere from, well, I don't know,
Right. Now I have in here just a footnote. Let me just read it. From that 1,290 days. From the intrusion of the abomination, there follow 1,290 days, including 1,260, which make up the last 3.5 years of the final 7 years. I'll just pause with that. But that's just a footnote, one thing a commentator has said. Anything else on verse 11? Okay. So verse 12, the individual goes on to say, how blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains to the 1,335 days. Now we have another number. Now when a person is blessed, what does that mean? They have good fortune. But another way the word blessed is used in the scriptures is they have God's approval. And so it's this person who continues enduring to an even longer period of time. They'd remain faithful to God in the midst of the trials they would face and be blessed or approved by Him when they continue enduring through those trials, no matter how long they last. I kind of put that in a nutshell, but any questions or comments on verse 12? Okay. So verse 13, the attention comes back to Daniel. What is Daniel supposed to do?
Go your way to the end.
Go your way to the end.
Don't worry about it.
Don't worry about these things. All these things are going to happen, but Daniel, live your life. Okay. And what is Daniel going to receive? His inheritance. But before that, you will enter into rest. And then you'll rise again to receive your inheritance, or as the New American Standard puts it, allotted portion at the end of the age. This is resurrection language. He's going to receive a reward for his faithfulness at the end of the age. That phrase, at the end of the age, in this context, refers to the end of the present time in which Daniel was living, but it's by extension the time in which we are living. Daniel would receive his reward if he continued to live faithfully to God the way he has been all throughout this book. So putting it in that context of Daniel entering rest, the point we should see here is that Daniel would enter rest even though the words he received would be sealed up. In these verses, Daniel has shown that he would receive rest even though the words he heard from this individual would be sealed or hidden from him. In other words, what Daniel has shown is that he would enter rest even though he would not hear more about what he had heard. So as a result, Daniel was to go on living his life in faithfulness to God, knowing that at the end of his life he would receive his reward for living in that way. Now, something else that might be implied in these verses is that he was not going to receive any more revelations from God. This could very well have been his last vision of his life. Why can we assume that? Because when Daniel has this conversation, he's an old man. Back at the beginning, he was 15 years old. But now by this point in Daniel, he's probably around 80 years of age and is no longer going to receive more revelations after this point. So putting verses 5 through 13 of this chapter in Daniel together, the point we should be left with concerning Daniel is that Daniel would enter rest. He'd enter rest even though he did not understand everything. He would enter rest even though the words he received would be sealed up. Application: we too have a rest to look forward to. Now, one thing the scriptures promise us is that we have a time of rest ahead of us. But if we want this rest, like Daniel, we also must go our way, live our life in faithfulness to God. And the result of this faithfulness, according to these verses, is that we will not only enter into rest, but we will also receive a reward for our faithfulness. And so we must go on living our lives, not concerning ourselves with those things that God has not revealed to us. Don't worry about those things. Instead, live your life in faithfulness to God, knowing there's a rest and a reward to look forward to in heaven if we live in that way. Any other questions or comments? Oh, sorry, Blake, you had your hand up.
I have to ask a question. So the physical destruction and the disruption of worship and the suffering that was caused along with the abomination of desolation, that was caused by the Seleucid Empire marching through Palestine on their way to war with Egypt.
I believe so. I read about that. So, good question. Anything else? All right. Blake, will you close us in a prayer today?